Tonight, I'd really like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Amy Hasinoff from the University of Colorado, Denver, where she's an associate professor. She studies gender and sexuality in the context of new media and technology. She's written a book called Sexting Panic, Rethinking Criminalization, Privacy and Consent. And she's currently working on projects in areas such as image-based sexual abuse and restorative and transformative justice. So today she's here to talk to us about restorative justice and its use in responding to online harms, which I'm very interested to hear about. So Amy, if you want to take it away, that'd be great.
There we go. 3 years on Zoom and I still forget to unmute myself. I'm sure you all have the same experience sometimes. I am delighted to be here. It's so great to talk to you all today about some research projects that I've been working on. Yeah, it's really exciting to talk to a full audience of people that do restorative justice stuff. Usually I'm talking to people that study technology and I'm telling them about restorative justice. So this is really great. I'm really excited to hear your perspectives, especially at the end when we get to Q&A. I would just love to know how this is landing with you, especially if you're a restorative justice practitioner, someone who studies it, someone who's involved in any way, because like I said, my typical audience is I'm talking to tech companies about this, I'm talking to people who study technology, and I get very different reactions, I think, than I'm going to get from you all. So I'm really excited to hear your questions. So please try to think of anything that comes up that you think is interesting that you want to ask me about or share with me. I'm really looking forward to that at the end. Okay, so social media. Yes, there are lots of problems with moderation and online harm and abuse. And if you feel like popping into the chat and just listing what is like one kind of problem you see with social media, just in general, in terms of things that are harassment or harm or abuse that you see in the platforms that you participate on, whether that's Facebook or Twitter, if you've moved to Mastodon. If you like have anything that just comes to mind, I would love to sort of populate the chat with those things, because I think we all know there are some issues. Or maybe you have a great experience of social media personally, and if that's the case, then I'm really, really happy for you, because not everybody does. And I think we probably are familiar with some of the research broadly and the statistics about how social media is not a great place for everyone. It's not a place where they feel safe. It's not a place where they feel respected all of the time. And of course, all of that is usually connected to different categories of identity, different forms of structural oppression that we can imagine are all very common and predictable, and ways that are much larger social problems, right? So one of the issues with moderation and why it kind of doesn't work so well online is that social media platforms have been designed for scalability, that ability to grow and grow and grow without really fundamentally changing the sort of basic elements. And of course, investors love this, right? Because they can invest a certain amount of money and they can see that exponential growth sort of going off the chart without really thinking about changing those sort of basic elements. And of course, this is why we prioritize profit on social media platforms, of course, right? Profit is the driving factor of all why these companies exist. I mean, the commercial ones. And this is why I think primarily the responses to online harm so far have been pretty inadequate, because with this drive to scale and grow and have that exponential curve, we end up with these kind of solutions to online harm that are bots and algorithms and content moderation that is called semi-automated. So you might have experienced this if you've ever reported something that's happened to you or someone you know online. You might click some buttons and say, this was the type of harm, this is when it happened, this was the user that was involved. And then of course, from there, what happens? Sometimes nothing, sometimes gets referred to a human moderator. So there's usually a connection, usually an initial automated part, and then maybe it will get referred to a human who is often very low paid. They might be very far off site. They may be in a different country, working under different labor laws than the country you live in. And they've been trained to sort of apply these rules universally without context or nuance, because they can't. They're just given a list of rules. And if the thing that you reported violates that rule, then they'll do something about it based on what they're allowed to do. And if it doesn't, then they won't. And if you're the one that reported it, you maybe will never hear what happened. That happens. So this is all because like the profit that comes from an online platform is just the more time that we spend on it, the more advertisements we see. And so platforms profit from all interactions between users, including interactions that are harassment or abuse. So let me repeat that because when I figured this out, it seemed pretty profound to me. They profit from abuse and harassment if we stay on the platforms, because every minute that we're looking at those pages, we are being served advertisements, and those advertisements are costing fractions of pennies every time we see them. So they're profiting from not fixing the problem, essentially, unless it gets to the point that we start spending less time on those platforms. So as long as we're still engaged and we're still spending time on those platforms, they're generating a profit. So there isn't a lot of incentive to do things differently. And I think that's a real problem that I want us to sort of grapple with today, and that I hope platforms will do a better job with. But it is a fundamental problem and a fundamental limitation. So in some research by Sarita Schoenbeck and Lindsay Blackwell from last year, they explained that in typical platform-driven moderation systems, all violators are treated equally, with users who unintentionally violate rules receiving the same sanctions as users who deliberately try to cause harm. And I think this is the key issue, is that it's been scaled up, right? And we treat everybody the same. Oops, sorry about that. We treat everybody the same, and it's as though these things sort of they're all identical, right? They don't make a distinction between them. Okay, so on an online platform, we typically have this type of structure of how are we dealing with what's happening. These are the questions that we're asking. What content is being reported, right? Is it actually against the rule? And initially, sometimes a robot, meaning like an algorithm, will be designed to determine, is this content violating the rule or not? And then the questions that we ask about what to do about that is usually, should that content be removed? Should it be demoted? Should it be flagged? Should it be ignored? There's a bunch of different options, but they basically, these are the options, okay? This really echoes what happens in criminal legal systems. And if you've read Howard Zare, which I'm sure many of you have, you will recognize these questions. And notice how similar they are to what's happening with content moderation. That's the connection that I want to highlight here. Because of course, in criminal justice, it's really echoing social media is echoing criminal justice, where the goal is, of course, this is Howard Zare's formulation, which laws were broken, who did it, how should they be punished? You all know this framework, right? With content moderation, it's so similar, right? Because we have the same problems, is that we're not offering a lot of help or recourse for people who've been harmed in both content moderation and in many criminal legal traditional systems, right? We're not meeting survivors' needs and desires. We're often not even paying much attention to them, especially in content moderation. So all of these problems that exist that you all know about in the criminal legal system, they're tenfold in content moderation, and there's no due process, and they're private companies. And we have this huge problem of scale. And we have all these faceless algorithms and bots that treat people even worse than when they go to get help from a criminal legal system, right? So research on this has shown in the content moderation sphere that people, of course, as they do in offline areas, have a variety of needs and desires beyond simply removing content or punishing the person who did this. So there's some emerging research on this that shows this problem exists in both places. Another problem is that, as it does in a criminal legal system, this sort of removal of content rather than actually dealing with it prevents the community from grappling with the incident. You all know this from your work in restorative justice. And I like to refer to Niles Christie here from the 70s, who talks about how courts and lawyers have stolen conflicts from individuals and from communities, which means that people who've been harmed don't have the opportunity to participate meaningfully in the resolutions of conflict. And we don't have a chance to clarify our norms as a community. So this is exactly what's happening with content moderation even more so, especially when you don't even know what's happened. I mean, at least when you make a report to the police, you can sometimes follow up and find out what happened to your report. You sometimes can't even do that online because there's no process. And then a third problem is, you all know that there's a lot of evidence that punishment is generally ineffective for deterring, for rehabilitation, for changing community norms, and that people often perceive punishment as arbitrary. All these things tenfold for content moderation. There's been some interesting work on how people perceive punishment as very arbitrary and very unfair, especially because with content moderation, there isn't the same sort of sense that we have. We know that like stealing is illegal, right? We kind of understand that if we're getting prosecuted for stealing, we have a sense, most people, that it's illegal. If you violate the rules of a platform, you might not even know what rule you violated. You have these pages long terms of service, community agreements that we all click through and consent, so to speak, that we're agreeing to live by these rules. Then we violate them, perhaps unintentionally, perhaps intentionally, but we don't even know sometimes. And so it can be very arbitrary and very seemingly unfair. And so there's some interesting research that's come out on that in the online moderation sort of context. So of course, restorative justice, again, you know Howard Zer's questions, but I want to keep them up there so that we can think about them in the context of what would that mean in an online space, right? How would that be different? And that's what I want us to talk about today. So and I think I just want us to also think about how these questions are so different than what content moderation is doing. We're not really looking at what the needs are of the people who've been harmed. We're not thinking about whose obligation is it to meet those needs, because we're not even paying attention to the needs. We're just focusing on removal, right? We're focusing on kind of creating this superficial sense of cleanliness of a platform, which is certainly necessary. We don't want to see violent stuff on Facebook when we're going on Facebook to share a cookie recipe, right? We don't want to see that. But if all we're doing is just removing content rather than actually dealing with issues, then we have, I think, led to some of the problems that exist. Okay, these goals you will also be familiar with. What are the goals? I want to keep them in mind while we think about content moderation and what it means to sort of think about these goals, which you're all familiar with, no doubt, in terms of what would it mean to do them online. So if we're thinking about that first one, how do we understand and meet the needs of the person who's been harmed? Again, content moderation is probably even worse than a criminal legal system because we don't even have victim services. We don't have victim compensation funds. There are very few nonprofits that even exist to sort of fill in the gaps of the criminal legal system that I'm sure some of you probably work in or are at least familiar with. That doesn't exist online. For the second one, where we think about inviting people who have caused harm to try to take accountability and sort of engage in repair, right? Not happening at all on large commercial platforms. At least in a criminal legal system, sometimes a conviction can feel like accountability for some people. It doesn't always, but it can. On an online platform, the punishments tend to be very, like I said, they're not usually even explaining what rule is even being violating sometimes, or people don't understand why they've been banned or blocked or whatever, and you can try to ask and find out. Sometimes they won't even tell you. And then on this third goal of trying to clarify norms and transform norms as well. This is something that we really don't see on large commercial platforms, but we do sometimes see on smaller, much smaller, more attentively moderated communities. Metafilter is an interesting example of this that some people talk about, where it's a very long-standing, smaller community. Some of the moderation is very attentive. They will try to work with people who have broken rules and try to explain to them why, what happened, did you not understand the rule, and maybe this is the right place for you, and maybe it isn't. And just to briefly define restorative justice versus transformative justice, because in the project that I'm about to talk about in a second, we talk to practitioners of both. And my understanding is that transformative justice is a bit more common in the US where I'm working. And so the way that I would distinguish these two is first to say, some people that I've talked to would say restorative and transformative justice are essentially the same, and others say they're completely different. How dare you? So there's a lot of different opinions about these sort of emerging definitions. But the understanding that I've come to is that restorative justice tends to be about clarifying values, and transformative justice is especially focused on confronting structural oppression and changing norms and conditions. And then the second part of transformative justice is that it's pretty much always, almost always at least, outside of criminal legal systems. So these would not operate as like a prosecutor diverts a case to an RJ program, or it wouldn't happen to a TJ program, a transformative justice program. They might, in the US, they do that, and I think they do in the UK too. Sometimes you'll have prosecutors diverting cases, but with transformative justice, they would not engage with state institutions at all. And so sometimes when you talk to transformative justice people, they say, we are completely different from RJ. And sometimes when you talk to RJ people, they say, well, we want structural change too. And so that's why I say like these definitions are tricky, but it is a bit, I wanted to highlight the two words because we did talk to different practitioners in our research. So for transformative justice, the sort of key thinkers that we drew on in our work was people like Mariam Kaba, Mimi Kim, Mia Mingus, and Adrienne Mary Brown. And these are all American sort of prison abolitionist type people that are working in that framework. So if anyone wants to learn more about those, I have citations in the papers that I've written. So this is where we're going. This is one of my collaborators, Neil Forrest Leahy, and she's working with me on the next project I'm going to talk about, but here's a quote from her in one of her other pieces where she says, "What is needed is not more sophisticated ways to identify and remove offending content, just as we don't need better ways of policing and imprisoning people. But what we need is ways of supporting survivors and transforming the societies in which harm happens, including our online social world." So this is a challenge, right? This is a challenge that we're sort of here to think about today. And I love the way that she has put this as this sort of imagining sort of a better future, because this is what we're here for, is to think about what could that alternative be. I don't think it's easy. I don't think it's simple. But I think it's really worth thinking about what could be different online. And there's a lot of challenges with that, but I'm fascinated by it. So a handful of journalists and researchers have begun thinking about this, including Nilüfer, who I work with, Sarita Shaina-Beck, Sajja Shao, Lindsay Blackwell, and Tyler Musgrave. Again, you can find citation stuff from me later if you want. And in my project with Nilüfer and then another person, Anna Gibson, we're pursuing this question of how do we apply lessons from restorative and transformative justice in online communities? And what we tried to do was try to map the differences and similarities between how restorative and transformative justice practitioners think about online harm versus how online moderators think about online harm. So we're trying to just map, just to get started, what is the differences and the similarities between those two different groups. And so what we did in this project is we conducted interviews and we ran some participatory design workshops where we give people a case, kind of like a focus group, but online, if you know that method. It's a little bit different, but if you have questions, I can answer them later. And so we had both the online moderators and the RJ and TJ practitioners and activists sort of talking to each other in these workshops, in addition to the interviews that we did. And so we're hoping from this research that we might be able to highlight where future research and interventions could focus in order to bridge the gaps of like, what are the challenges, what are the differences, how could online communities and platforms moderation practices, how could they change? What would they need to change if they were going to orient towards restorative or transformative justice instead of what they're doing right now? And so we coded and analyzed the transcripts from all these cases. And what we found was there was 3 spectrums that we identified that described the differences and similarities between content moderation online and restorative and transformative justice facilitation. So the first spectrum was looking at how both RJ and TJ are primarily concerned with first meeting the individual needs of the person who was harmed, right? Like that's our focus typically. The person who was harmed, what do they need? And moderators online sometimes were focused on individuals, but other times really saw this as outside the scope of what they were trying to do. Because for a lot of moderators, the focus of their intervention was often content, as I talked about before. It was trying to fix that content issue of like, let's just focus on the piece of thing that was posted rather than the person, right? Because that's what their job is. And sometimes they would sort of turn to individuals if there was a repeated offense or an egregious offense, but often they really started with content. That same time, some moderators did try to engage with individuals to try to help them understand community norms, as I mentioned, with some more like meta filter. And of course, sometimes restorative justice processes are more focused on individuals, and will only involve community members as sources of support, or sometimes, of course, like when you have someone embodying community values. And so sometimes individuals are the focus rather than the community itself. And that works sometimes for some restorative justice programs. Of course, a difference there is transformative justice people tend to always bring in that larger system of oppression that they're trying to intervene on. And so the community itself is almost always going to be another site of intervention for the transformative justice people. They would probably not be okay with just a process that only focused on like an individual coming to terms and making their repairs on an individual basis. Our second one was about the mechanisms of how they work. And so what we found is that some moderators are exclusively focused on enforcing rules and using both automated and manual tools as fairly and as impartially as possible. A lot of them had a strong value on that. And many felt that the tools worked fairly well for like minor violations when people like didn't understand the rules or were just sort of temporarily acting out, and that they could use the tools that they had effectively. But they really struggled to deal with more serious and more intentional harm and harassment. There, they felt like the tools that they had were really lacking, and they really struggled with how to help people and how to solve these conflicts. And our practitioners, RJ and TJ, of course, stressed facilitating dialogue, as I'm sure you know, and as I'm sure you do, over enforcing rules, right? They described this as a lot of one-on-one conversations. I'm sure many of you would describe your work in similar ways. Of course, between the facilitators and the individuals, sometimes between the different people involved, and sometimes between the people and the community. And the moderators described doing that a lot less. Of course, it was really outside the scope of what they were doing most of the time. There were some interesting continuities, though, between both groups, the moderators and the facilitators, because when we discussed a fictional workplace-related incident with our workshop participants, they both agreed that it could make sense to refer the case to like a professional licensing board that might have been specifying a code of conduct violation. So it's not that people don't use rules in RJ and TJ. Sometimes we refer to outside rules to make a point, to achieve a justice aim, right? That's not outside the norm at all. It just wouldn't necessarily be the main focus, at least for the people we talk to. And of course, community moderators do engage in dialogue. The online moderators, they do try to educate people who caused harm. Sometimes they don't have time if it's a really big community. Sometimes they want to do more than they can. And some even do try to facilitate conversations between people involved in the conflict. That's already happening in online communities, which of course makes sense, but I think is an interesting way that there are a lot of similarities already between what's happening, even if they're not, the moderators, the online moderators we talked to were not at all identifying themselves as restorative justice or transformative justice focused, or some of them hadn't even heard these terms or knew much about them, but they were still sometimes going in there and trying to facilitate conflict resolution. So interesting sort of continuity there. And of course, a challenge of applying RJ online is it's just very time and resource intensive, and we can't do it with bots, and talk about that later. And then the last spectrum that we found was to think about how the goals are different. So a lot of moderators were really focused on maintaining order, maintaining that cleanliness. One of the moderators said, this is a quote, "So the case of forum moderators, our job is basically just to clean it up. So it would be nice if we could do more conflict resolution, but our job in general is to remain as neutral as possible." That's the end quote. Which was different from our facilitators. Our RJ and TJ facilitators talked about validating people, hearing their needs, talking to both parties, finding out what they need, finding out how they've been hurt, all of the stuff that you're all familiar with. And And of course, at the same time, we did talk to RJ facilitators who were a little bit more aligned with some of our online moderators, where they talked about repair and to restore things to the way that they were before, right? To sort of ask individuals to do that process of change, to repair that harm, and to like maintain order in a sense, and like to help someone understand stealing is wrong. We don't tolerate stealing in this community, right? And so we're going to change your attitude about stealing so that you can be an accepted member of this community. That's not necessarily about any broader transformation of the community itself. It's more about that person. It can involve healing, of course, in a restorative justice context, for sure. But does it go more towards maintenance? For some of the restorative justice people we talked to, it did go more towards maintenance than transformation, though healing maybe should be in the middle on that spectrum. This is still a work in progress. Some moderators also did talk about working with communities to update rules as the community evolved. So it's not necessarily all about maintenance for online community moderators. Sometimes there's a process of working with the community to change the rules when the rules aren't working anymore. So they are doing transformation on a broader level. So there's lots of interesting similarities and differences that we all found together. So this question of how do you take these things sort of that are more on the right-hand side and apply them to a larger system, especially a for-profit system? There are, of course, many challenges. And we, in some other work that I've done with Nathan Schneider, who's at University of Colorado Boulder, just slightly north of me here in Denver. This is a different paper. This one is out, so if you're interested, I'll have a link for you later. This question of how do you grow this, right? What we found in what I found in both projects is that restorative justice and transformative justice practitioners, both of them, are always stressing adapting their methods and approaches to the context, to the case, and to the person, right? And so we started by thinking about how have these practitioners already pursued scale in offline contexts, and what have been the sort of benefits and challenges of scaling, of growing, right? And what we saw in the literature was that restorative justice has pursued scale through standardization, through standard programs, training, modules, processes, procedures that are, of course, adaptable to context, right? And that it's especially often that it'll be standardized when it's embedded within criminal legal systems, within educational systems, right? And of course, one thing that we found that was interesting about that, we found a paper from Choi and some co-authors from 2012, warning that focusing on specific outcomes, like getting an apology or closing a case, really has a big risk to it of decentering the person who's been harmed and re-traumatizing them. So that paper was super helpful for us in thinking about scale and thinking about how tech companies might try to apply restorative justice in ways that cause more harm. And I have to say that I've had a number of conversations with people working at tech companies. I won't name them, but they always are really interested in restorative justice as a way to get perpetrators, people who caused harm, back onto their platforms quicker. And I'm always telling them, what about the people who have been harmed? How are you going to deal with that first? Because their focus is typically, how do I get the person who's caused the harm back engaged, back spending minutes and hours on my platform? Because that's their goal, is increase users. And I shouldn't be so cynical. Many of them have really sincere desires to make their platform safer and better, but they make that very common mistake of oh, what if we can just invite the person who caused harm to literally click a box to offer an apology. And I have to slow them down and say, there's a lot of research from restorative justice about when you do this without proper attention to the people who've been harmed, it can cause more harm. And there's a bunch of literature on that. Probably many of you are familiar with it, but I liked this paper from Choi and the co-authors that really summarized all of these problems of trying to sort of standardize and scale and be outcome focused, and how that can really go wrong for people who've been harmed and cause more re-traumatization. So whenever I talk to people at tech companies, I'm usually saying the same thing, which is slow down, think about the people who've been harmed. I know you're excited, I'm glad you're excited, but let's pull it back a little bit to some basic principles. And they understand when I explain it, but it's interesting that I have the same conversation multiple times. Um, Okay, so how do we think about scale? In our paper and in the work with Nilüfer and Anna as well, we've come up with a couple of things that we think are useful for thinking about scale. And I think I'll try to wrap this up in about 5 or 10 minutes, and then I'm really excited to hear your reactions and questions. So this first one is to embrace those affordances of online context. I'm really curious in the Q&A if anyone wants to share with me how it has been for you to move any RJ practices online in COVID. I started this project pre-COVID, and I would talk to RJ people pre-COVID, and they would say, you can't do RJ online. It's impossible. There's no way. Like it just wouldn't work. You need to be in a circle. You need to be present together. You need to be sharing body language and emotional space. And I said, okay. Now we're in a different place post-COVID. People have been forced to do RJ circles online. They've been forced to do RJ processes online. It is a fascinating change. I wish COVID didn't force us to do it, but it is really interesting that people have really changed their opinions about RJ, at least the people I've talked to. So I'm curious how it's been for you all, if you've moved your practices into Zoom or somewhere else online, if this is true. I found a little bit of research on this, but it's so new that I didn't find a lot. And so, the things that I did find that I think are relevant is that in an online context, voluntary participation is even easier. And so, of course, as all of you know, voluntariness is a really important virtue in restorative and transformative justice. If someone's being coerced to be there and then offering an apology, we know it's not sincere. It can cause more harm. So it's even more voluntary. So we talk about weak ties, right? In a sort of new media studies, the technology studies context, sociology, this might be a familiar term, just people that you know but don't know that well, communities you're part of but not super, maybe like super committed to in a certain way. Weak ties are not necessarily a bad thing, because if your process is voluntary, there's something positive about that. The fact that you can leave at any time and you can just like click a button and you're gone, there's some virtue to that, I think, in RJ that we can think about more. Another thing that we thought about as a positive affordance, meaning something that technology can do for us, is to coordinate communication, right? Just the sort of basic thing of like a social network enables you to send a message to people, to get replies, to coordinate meeting times. There's all sorts of little tools that I am curious if some of you have adopted and found useful, like using a doodle poll. I mean, I hate doodle polls as much as everyone, but like there's not a lot of better tools out there for trying to get a meeting between 10 people all to meet at the same time. And of course, accessibility. This is something that has come up in the research too, the limited research that exists. Of course, like if people are in different places, if they don't want to be in the same room as someone, of course, this using media tools to create distance between a person who's been harmed and a person who's caused harm predates Zoom, right? There's letter writing. Maybe some of you have used letter writing in your practice. That's a form of media that creates distance between people. It's asynchronous. A letter is. A Zoom can be synchronous. You could have cameras off. So there's all sorts of ways that technology makes it more accessible for different people in different situations. And this one is the concept of subsidiarity is part of the paper with Nathan. So if you're interested in that, definitely check out that paper. But basically what that means is that we were trying to think about how can you structure something that's big in a way that would actually work for the principles of restorative justice. And what we came up with was to use subsidiarity. And if you don't know this word, I guarantee you know the concept. The EU is basically a subsidiary structure. There are member states that have a shared commitment to a larger organization, the EU, right? That's all subsidiarity means. There's a lot more detail to it, but that's all you need to know right now if you don't know this concept. Basically, smaller units that have some allegiance or connection to a larger structure. And those smaller units can set their own laws, their own policies, and they have a relationship with the larger thing. They're all part of it, right? And so we looked at this as a governance structure as an alternative to that scalability, where all you have is these automated, semi-automated stuff that just gets applied globally, right? So Twitter creates its policies. There may be like national differences that are sometimes minor, sometimes bigger, but they're fundamental systems of how do they moderate content is they're deploying it at scale. They're just scaling it up to billions. They might be have billions of users now, to billions of people. And it's fundamentally the same thing, which is why it's so profitable. But what does it mean to slow that process down, to have more local control? We think this has a lot of potential for restorative justice. This is why I'm excited about people moving to Mastodon. Some of you might have heard of Mastodon recently with the Twitter changes at Twitter that's been happening recently. And so Mastodon is a good example of something that there are these smaller structures that are all connected to one bigger structure, and each smaller structure can create its rules, can create its norms, can have its processes. Mastodon at this point is not some restorative justice project by any means. It's just that governance structure, that's subsidiarity, could lead to it. It could support it much better than a commercial platform like Twitter, where it's just all scaled, it's all universal rules, it's all apply the same thing across everywhere. What's cool about Mastodon and exciting is that each little instance has its own way of working. And of course, there's many challenges and many strengths of this sort of subsidiarity framework. But the really fascinating and I think exciting thing about it is that the point of the framework is that it demands how do we define and how do we manage the relationships both within the local units and then within the local units among each other. So how do these relationships between communities work? And that's the point, is to build that. The point is to think about it. I don't have an answer for you, but the exciting thing about it is that that's the point. And then the last one, the commercial platforms are not going to be excited about this. So I think if we wanted them to do restorative justice online, we would probably need some policy changes to force them to do it, because though I think their platforms would be better off for it, I think they would be better places to hang out. I think they would cause less harm. I think we could change a lot of things if we took a restorative justice approach online. But it's going to cost more because it can't be scaled in the same way that a bot and an algorithm can be scaled. It requires humans. You all know this, right? You can't just do this by checking off boxes and following a formula. It has to be tailored to each person. You need a human person who can talk to people and engage in dialogue and hear emotions and all of these important things that so far, we are a very long way from a robot ever being able to do that effectively. I don't think it will ever happen personally. If anyone wants to disagree on that, feel free to get into a debate about robots. But the point being is I think we need humans. And humans cost money because you have to pay them for their time and you have to find people who are trained or you have to train them, and that is resource intensive. But the whole point of this argument is that of course, like what we're doing now is not working very well. They do have to spend a lot of money on lobbying and on lawsuits and on public relations. Whenever something goes poorly, they do have to spend money on it. So we're optimistic that maybe there'd be some way with policy to sort of nudge them in this direction of doing a better job. And the way that we think about what the possibility is here is we're wondering if there's a way that we could imagine sort of online governance structures, moderation, in ways that don't repeat the same problems of the criminal legal system that you all know about, that don't rely on punishment, that don't fail to meet needs, and that are capable of fostering like deeper change and larger conversations. We do not have all the answers, but we're excited about the possibilities. And I would really be delighted to hear from all of you. Feel free to contact me at any of these places. But for the rest of our time together today, I would love to hear your reactions, your thoughts, your questions about any of this. All these are projects in process. The one on subsidiarity was just published about a month ago. The one with Nilafar and Anna, we're still in progress. And then there's some other things that are in progress too. So this is all very new, and your feedback is very much welcome. Yeah, so I'll leave that slide up for a second so you can write down anything you need to, but yeah, I'm happy to take questions. So thank you.
Thank you so much. It's really, really fascinating. And I have all sorts of questions going around my head of how this might work in practice. Does anyone have any questions that you'd like to raise, either in the chat or if anyone wants to ask a question via video? If you want to answer a question via video, you kind of raise your virtual hand on Zoom, and that will help me to notice that. I guess I can start with a question, which is, as you're talking, it's making me think of, I guess, where the first starting point, I suppose, might be. I think it can be easy to look at this and go, oh, well, where would you even start? I guess something that occurs to me is that idea kind of subsidiarity or things like that, where there's already sort of existing communities that are much more community based on social media. So like Facebook groups comes to mind. Like I know here in Oxford, there's like an Oxford community Facebook group, which has like thousands of members, but you know, there's all sorts of weird and wonderful stuff that gets posted on that group. And there can be all sorts of conflicts about all sorts of different local issues that people have very strong opinions about. But it occurred to me, of course, there's moderators that are in charge of running that group. Do you think there are ways that could be harnessed, or kind of people in those sort of roles could be particularly, I guess, targeted for some sort of training as kind of like a starting point? I don't know if that's something that you've like experimented with or thought about at all, or.
Yeah, no, I love the question, and that's a great idea. Like that's something that it's something I want to do in future research. I haven't been able to do it yet because I haven't been able to find quite the right community that really wants to do it. And then also there's like with research of any size or scale, there's funding issues. So if any of you out there know of an online community that you think maybe already has some familiarity with restorative justice, but hasn't tried to implement it online yet, or if they have, like definitely tell me about that, because I'm always looking for examples to study, and they're very hard to find because what the limited research that exists on like how are people applying these principles already online, even if they don't know what the word restorative justice means, is like people will find, like I sort of talked about briefly, and Sijia Chow works on this a little bit in some gaming communities, where they look at like how do people resolve conflicts between people that are involved, right? And sometimes what they're doing is similar to a restorative justice type approach, even though these people have never studied it, they maybe never heard the word, they've never been practitioners in an offline context, they just are trying to like solve problems in a sort of organic way between people and trying to create dialogue between them, right? So first response is if anyone knows of a place where that's explicitly happening online, like please contact me. I would love to hear more about it. And the second part of your question is like, yes, I would love to do that research project. I have been looking for a community that wants to do it. I would love to like partner with restorative or transformative justice practitioners to like create some kind of training that would be for online moderators, and then pilot it, evaluate it, see how it goes. I would love to do this project. So if there's anyone out there that also wants to do this project, please contact me, because I think it's a great idea and it's on my to-do list of like, I want to make this happen, but haven't been able to yet.
Yeah, I'd be really interested if ever is possible. Rosie, you have a question.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. That was brilliant. And in a way, my question is very simple. When I put my hand up, was very similar to Joyce. But I suppose I'm interested to know if you think how much recognition there is within social media platforms that what's their appetite for change, basically, and the openness to pilot new ways of doing things.
Yeah, I mean, with the commercial platforms, I've definitely been frustrated because whenever they talk to me, it's been about getting people who caused harm back on their platforms initially. And so their appetite for doing I honestly been very frustrated because they don't want to spend any money on it. They want to talk to me and they want to know, like, how can this be automated? How can this be scalable? How can this be the same sort of stuff we've already been doing, but just with like an RJ twist on it? And they hate my answer, because my answer is you need to hire human trained moderators and victim support services and they kind of look at me like, okay, like that's not the answer they wanted, because what they wanted was scalable solutions. They wanted to be able to send their programmers off to create like an RJ algorithm. And no, I'm serious. Like I'm being a little cynical, but like basically it seems like that's what they want. And I'll ask them like, do you have any capacity to hire a couple people to pilot this? And they're like, oh, I don't think we can hire anyone. Like, and it's like, okay. So with commercial platforms, everyone that I've talked to so far, I've been pretty disappointed. They don't want to spend money on this yet. The problem for them is not bad enough yet. They're making too much money, just to be very cynical and direct. They're making too much money to spend any more money on trying to solve the problems that they've created. There's nothing forcing them to do it, right? I will say that on smaller nonprofit platforms, it's a totally different story. So when I talk to moderators on like Metafilter, moderators on new Mastodon instances, moderators on really small subreddits, they are fascinated by this because they're like, what I want is to have a healthy community. I don't want to be dealing with all these problems because they're not being paid. They're often volunteers. Some of them are paid, but often we've talked to a lot of people that are volunteers. And they are so excited about this. They don't know how to do it. They don't have the time and the bandwidth to like take a 100-hour RJ training certification. That's a big barrier for them because they're nonprofit and because like they're not being compensated at all. So that's the tension there, is like you have an individual who's like a moderator of a community and they're like, oh, I think RJ would be so great for this community, but like I don't know how to do it, and I don't have the time to like get myself certified as an RJ practitioner or get myself trained. And so there's the barrier there. But the appetite, I think, is there for a lot of smaller communities where like they just really care about the health of their community and they see restorative justice as a way to create a healthier community.
It's interesting that Andrew Stern in the chat has made an interesting comment about local moderators. I won't take the words out of his mouth, but that does seem to be a sort of a feasible level at which to do things, because the scaling is scary, isn't it, actually?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that comment. I mean, that's definitely what we found in talking to some of the moderators, is that like people are doing this stuff, whether they know the word RJ or not. Like it's, some of it is organic and some of it is just a natural response when you have a small enough group. How am I going to deal with conflict? How am I going to deal with incivility? And the answer is not to have them click through a bunch of boxes and have a bot like reject their thing, but to actually send someone a human message like, hey, I didn't know if you knew this, but like this word, some people find offensive. Here's why. Like that's so different than just banning someone for using a word that's on a list of banned words. And so then like that type of thing, even if they don't know that like that could be something that's informed by principles of RJ, they don't necessarily know that. And so they're just instinctively, and I don't know if in the comment those people knew about RJ in particular or not, but what we found is that they don't necessarily have training or background in the concepts, but they're just organically doing stuff that's just about dialogue and about trying to understand, meeting people where they're at, trying to understand, help people understand the harm that they've caused, especially if it's unintentional. And most people, I think, as you all probably know in your experience, a lot of people, once they understand they've caused harm, they want to do something about it. They want to repair it. They want to make it better. They want to, if they want to stay in that community, they want to engage in that repair.
Yeah.
There's something else in the comment. I don't know if we want to go to that one. Or in
yeah,
the chat.
So Gurjit has a really interesting comment, which is saying something about kind of the interaction between online and offline harms. They said that is a shame regarding commercial approach. Have worked with many children and young people who have experienced harm offline due to initial online harms. A lot of children are also being criminalized due to their online behavior.
Yeah. I mean, the second part was a lot of the focus of my earlier work on sexting, about how kids and teens would be criminalized for consensual sexting, right? Especially in the US. And I imagine this is the case in the UK, but it especially happens with children of color and queer kids in particular. So that was really a problem with sexting. I don't know if that's happening as much anymore. I haven't kept up on it, but I'm sure that that's true in a lot of other cases. But that connection between online and offline is super interesting. And I think it to me, it highlights the issue of why platforms need to do better. They've kind of washed their hands of it. They try. I shouldn't overgeneralize. Different platforms are trying different things. They're not all the same. Some of them have launched some interesting initiatives to try to solve some problems here and there. Some of them are working with researchers. Some of them don't. There's a big variety. So when I'm just being cynical, I just say the platforms are failing, because when I sort of look at them all together, and overall, they seem to be, in my opinion, overall they're failing. And so of course we have these things where this harm starts online, it moves offline, it goes back and forth either way. We're no longer, I mean, maybe 20 years ago, we could have said, oh, offline is a separate place than online. Certainly since we've been through the first few years of COVID, I think all of us really see now that online and offline are inseparable, and that it's just different media for the same human interactions that then change things slightly or don't in different ways. I mean, even 10, 15 years ago when I was working on sexting initially, people would sort of ask me questions about like, oh, isn't this sort of, aren't these things separate? Like, isn't offline really different from online? Like, is there really a connection? Aren't they just separate spheres? And at that point I was saying, no, it's always both. It's always both. There's everything online is offline and or whatever, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
We all see this now.
Do you think that interaction is a way to try to encourage platforms to take it more seriously? Like it seems to me that sometimes when platforms do take it more seriously, let's say someone's been, I don't know, trolling someone or sending someone abusive messages, and then they start stalking that person and actually they're turning up outside their house, and then everyone's like, oh, well, actually, this isn't just a message now, this is actually like a physical threat. Do you think that causes platforms more alarm and then they're more likely to take that seriously? Or do you think in general, as long as they can wash their hands of it, they're not as concerned?
Yeah, I mean, again, being cynical, like when it goes offline, then they can report to local police and then they can wash their hands of it because they're like, well, we forwarded this, we're done. Like legally, we're done, right? And so if there's not an incentive for them to really fix it, the only incentive is bad PR. And the only incentive is when things really go bad for them in the press and they get blamed in the press for something bad happening, something really bad happening that started on their platform that they maybe could have done something about. And so it's difficult. I'm sure there's cases where platforms have sort of taken this opportunity to do better, but overall, I don't have empirical evidence of this, but to me, it feels like when something goes offline, they report it to local agencies and then they're done with it because they're like, well, we don't deal with stalking, right? Like that's police domain. We don't have to deal with this. So unless it's PR, which PR is meaningful. I mean, if people react badly, they don't want to lose users, right? They don't want to lose eyeballs on their advertisements because that's where their profit comes from. But I wish my answer was different, but that's my sense of it. Maybe there's a different perspective someone else has on it, but that would be mine at this moment.
That's really interesting. And we probably have time now for one more question or comment if anyone else has anything burning on their mind they want to share. Otherwise, I think we've had a really, really interesting session. Rosie, is that you raising your hand again, or is that?
Yeah, sorry to butt in again. I suppose I was interested to hear from Amy what's next on your agenda and where you see the opportunities for what you might call action research. So where can things be piloted, or where are you doing that already?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely what I want to do next. I just need to I've been looking for like the right online community to try this with, but I would love to. I would love to do that, to try to figure out like, is there a way to create some kind of training or set of modules? I don't know what it would look like. I would want to work with an RJ trained person. I don't have any training in RJ. I'm more of an armchair RJ person where I read a lot about it. I've not been a facilitator myself. So I would want to work with a facilitator. So if any of you out there are interested in this, please contact me. And then find a community and find an online community and see what happens, how we can work with moderators to develop new stuff. I sometimes work with computer scientists too, and they're always really interested in developing tools, which is fun. It can be fun. And so then the question is like, what kind of tools would moderators need to do restorative justice online? And so I have some sort of potential projects there where it would sort of look at, the tools they have now are banning and blocking and shadow banning and that kind of thing. And they have semi-automated stuff. They do on Reddit, for example, they have automod tools. Those are like semi-automated tools they can use to keep their platforms, their subreddits clean-ish. But what else would they need in terms of technical tools, right? I think that would be an interesting question too for in-person RJ people that are trying to do circles and processes in an online context. Is there something better than Zoom? I don't know. This would definitely be on my I'm not a computer scientist either, so I wouldn't know how to do it, but if there's some different way to facilitate RJ stuff in online spaces that do a better job. Maybe Zoom is fine. I don't know. That would be an interesting question. But yeah, that sort of piloting and evaluating stuff would be really interesting. And this policy question is interesting to me too, of like, what would that even look like if we were going to try to encourage platforms? And it wouldn't necessarily have to be an RJ approach, but just any kind of policy that would encourage platforms to do better and to do better with online harm. Because right now, and I've talked to a lot of people that work at nonprofits that deal with the fallout of online harm, and they're just struggling. I mean, maybe some of you are part of these organizations. I know they're just struggling to get funding for the next year, the next 6 months, and they're just dealing with all of the problems that online platforms have refused. Sorry about that. Have refused to fix because they don't have to fix it. And so then you have this whole industry of nonprofits that are doing victim services, that are doing education, and they're all struggling. Every time I interviewed them for a different project, a bunch of people that do image-based abuse nonprofits. They're working so hard, and like meanwhile, Facebook is making billions of dollars, and these nonprofits can barely scrape together like $100,000 or £100,000, whatever, to run their organization for the next year. And it's like, I'm riffing, but at this point, I don't remember where I started talking about that. Sorry. I was just upset.
Yeah, lots of interesting ideas for what's next. We've had a couple of other things just quickly before we wrap up. Jane Bryan has just put in the chat saying that Warwick University's esports centre is very active, and so she works at Warwick University, so she'd be happy to introduce you if that might be something you might be interested to get in contact with. And Andrew so it'd be really interesting if someone who's in a school that has an RJ or mediation approach could facilitate discussion among young people and how they see online harms and how to repair. And I agree, that would be really interesting. I think particularly as young people, kind of the lines between online and offline are so blurred now, isn't it, in the kind of relationships, friendships, communities at school, etc., isn't it? So it's really interesting to see how they see that interaction between online and offline, and what might be a useful approach.
Totally. No, I love the school connection too, because the research that I've seen on RJ in schools and doing it well, it so much focuses on like what we might call onboarding in a corporate sense, of like norm setting at the beginning of the term, of the semester, which I think is so important for online communities, is to engage in those like discussions about like, what are our norms, what are our values? And I look to the literature on schools for that. So that's a great connection.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Amy. I think I speak for everyone when I say it's been really, really fascinating. And really thank you so much for sharing that with us. Just to echo some of the things I mentioned at the beginning of the event today, if you want to join our mailing list, you're not on our mailing list, and we'd love to stay in contact with you, so you can join that at the link that I just put in the chat there. Also, please, if you can, fill out this evaluation form. If you click the link now, then when the chat goes away, when I close the meeting, then you at least have it open. So click that link and have it open in your browser. And we'd really love to hear your thoughts and also your ideas for future events, because I'm always trying to come up with ideas for future events, following any leads. So we'd love to hear what would be useful for you or interesting to you, or if you have any ideas. We also have a few other upcoming events. So in Restorative Justice Week, which is later this month, on the 23rd of November, we have an event on sharing tools to support restorative conversations. And that will be much more kind of a very interactive, more training style. It's not really a training course, but a training sort of style event. An opportunity to learn about and share creative ways to use restorative approaches in various contexts, and also for you all to share your own expertise with other people. Also on the 6th of December, we're still finalising the very finer details, but we're going to have an event similar to this on the topic of empathy and restorative justice. So looking at how empathy and restorative justice are linked, and what we can learn by thinking about empathy. We don't have the registration link up for that just yet, but I'll hopefully get that up next week, and details will be on our website, so please keep your eye out there. And I will wrap up there. Like I said, thank you so much, Amy. Thank you everyone for attending, and it's been a really fascinating conversation, and hope to see you all soon. Thank you very much.